We're going to launch this discussion by presenting the most up-to-date case relevant to AML laws. This is the case which I'm sure you're all familiar with. It's the case of the company Plus 500. Now, this company enjoyed great success. This is a company that was backed by major hedge funds and banks such as JP Morgan. This company actually had a sponsorship deal with Atletico Madrid and definitely enjoyed great success and had a stable place in the market. Now, on May 2015, this company was on a free fall due to FCA investigation. This investigation detected flaws in the KYC process of the company, which included bad documentation in the sign-up process of new clients. Such defects included bad documentation, which was unreadable. And as a result, this company had 17,000 of its UK clients' accounts frozen. Needless to say, this has caused bad damage to the reputation of the company, which led to the shares plummeting. Now, Dr. Planzer, please, can you tell us, is the Plus 500 case simply a random case of bad luck, or are you aware of other AML cases?
Thank you. No, there have been recently other very prominent cases as well, including the Trump Taj Mahal in Atlantic City that had to pay $10 million in a fine, or as well in Las Vegas, the Sands Corporation through the Venetian and Palazzo, which had to pay $47 million for not complying with AML rules. So you kind of see the dimensions what we are talking about. In both cases, this was due to a lack of filing suspicious activity reports.
Okay. Can you illustrate for us the significance of AML rules for gaming and financial trading businesses?
So naturally, AML rules are nothing new to the core of the financial industry. So banks and insurances have needed to deal with those rules for several decades. Maybe with regard to the financial traders, it's important to keep in mind that they may fall within the scope of AML rules too. When you are a financial intermediary, then you regularly do. So what is a financial intermediary? We're talking about a legal or natural person who, as part of their services, professionally deals with third parties' assets. So either by accepting, holding, placing, or transferring these assets. So this is a crucial question you have to ask yourself. And then with regard to the gaming services industry, I think it's fair to say that the days where you could take AML rules lightly are definitely over. President Hoffman also mentioned that compliance has become increasingly important, not just because of the fines, it also constitutes major reputational risks. So these companies may face severe administrative or civil sanctions if they don't comply with AML rules. And importantly, if you are part of the board or part of the management of such a company, please keep in mind that in several countries there can be sanctions and measures applicable to the management body, so not just to the company, so that you are responsible, accountable as a natural person. And in several countries, the obliged entities have to define one member of the management board that is responsible for the implementation of AML rules. So I think we really need a cultural change in terms of how companies approach these issues. And maybe allow me to say just a few words on the situation in Europe, because the European Union just adopted a new AML directive in May 2015. It was published, and it includes important adjustments for the industry. For the first time, online gambling services are now expressly covered by the scope of the directive. And the rationale behind this is actually that online gambling services, electronic financial products that we have prominently represented here as well, can partially substitute functions of banks. So you may have several accounts, you may have transfers, you have pays, you have payouts, and this is the rationale for including these services.
Now, can you tell us, are those rules significant for businesses in the European Union only?
Yeah, that's a good question, because we're talking about the EU directive, right? But we are generally observing a trend of countries adjusting their AML rules also outside the European Union. I understand in Israel recently there have been a change to also include lawyers and accountants under AML law. That's actually also very similar in Switzerland. The reason being, if a lawyer does not act within his traditional or classic portfolio, but maybe dealing with real estate or placing assets of a client, then he's acting within a sphere that is relevant for AML rules. But why is it that those rules or principles of that the EU has just adopted are also relevant for countries outside, let's say Israel? This is because of the bigger global policy picture. So we have to wonder who is behind those rules. This is not just the European Union, it's actually the FATF. So the Financial Action Task Force, which is composed of 36 members, including very powerful members, including the US, including the European Union. And it is a policy-making body that sets standards, global standards, with regard to effective measures against money laundering, and that is the second aspect why some countries put so much pressure on it, terrorist financing. So when you read carefully the title of an anti-money laundering statute, it usually says terrorist financing as well. Now, how is this being done, that other countries have to comply with this as well? This is done through political pressure and blacklisting. And it's very, very normal that if you want to be perceived as a reliable and decent financial hub, you don't want to end up on such a blacklist. So the FATF has developed a series of recommendations, and most importantly, in 2012, these recommendations have been condensed in 40 recommendations, and they pretty much represent now the global standard of AML rules.
And in your view, what are the major changes with regards to AML rules that result from the FATF policy making efforts?
So, keeping in mind that this is driven by the FATF, let me come back to the concrete example of the fourth EU AML directive again, to illustrate these changes. What has changed with this directive, as I already mentioned, is the scope of application. So for the first time, the entire gambling sector has to comply with AML rules. Before, the third directive only mentioned casinos. Then we have been moving from a more static approach to AML assessment to a more dynamic, risk-based approach, and hopefully we'll get the chance to talk about this in more detail later. I should also mention PEPs, politically exposed persons, that now also include national politically exposed persons. It used to be focused on foreign politically exposed persons. So when you have politically exposed persons in your portfolio, you need to be particularly careful with your AML policy. Then, very important to note is also that the relevant related criminal activities have been dramatically expanded over the years. The financial proceeds that used to be relevant at the time were mainly stemming from narcotics. But this has been extended over and over, and most recently tax evasion, tax crimes have also been included. This is no coincidence because the FATF works through the Secretariat of the OECD in Paris. And as you might know, the OECD has put major pressure on a lot of countries to adjust their tax regimes, such as Austria, Belgium, Switzerland, but also other third countries like Singapore. Then the threshold of the relevant money threshold has been lowered to 2,000 euros only. So that means when you have transfers of 2,000 euros, the Know Your Customer standards apply. Now, even more importantly, this does not need to be one payment. It can be several payments that appear, quote, to be linked. So that means it could be 5 payments of 400 euros, and you already are within the scope of the directive. And that also means that you're no longer talking about huge payments of the like of Pablo Escobar, but we're talking about pretty much Mr. John Doe, or as you say in Israel, Israeli. It's just, it can be any common person that is affected by this. And finally, maybe to mention, there will be third country lists. So again, this idea of naming and shaming and blacklisting countries that are not compliant. Yeah.
Okay, well, this seems to be definitely significant changes. So can we take a closer look at some of them? Would you be kind to elaborate on the significance of the lowered threshold of the 2,000 euros, as you mentioned, for gaming businesses, that is?
Yeah, so this is really remarkable, and we see this also in other countries. The threshold has also been lowered in Switzerland. It's a general pattern that we observe, that these thresholds have been continuously lowered, and as I said before, hereby you no longer just have the big whales that will qualify to fall within these KYC requirements, but it could be pretty much anybody. It could be Mr. John Doe who's just enjoying his Christmas bonus and trying to get lucky online. It's also remarkable that the EU went even under the threshold recommended by the FATF, which is 300 euros or $300, both currencies are mentioned. So going down to 2,000 is a remarkably low threshold, and we have to keep in mind that according to the directive, each member state can decide to go even lower. So normally we think of a directive as a harmonizing instrument, but with regard to these aspects, it's actually not. A member state can feel free to say, we lower the threshold as low as 500 euros.
Well, can you tell us also about the politically exposed person that you've mentioned?
So I think I did mention before that now also national politically exposed persons are included within the scope of the directive. Also family members of politically exposed persons. And maybe we should ask ourselves, why is this the case? This has to do again with the extended list of relevant criminal acts. Very prominently now tax evasion is mentioned as well, bribery, corruption. And when we think in what setting bribery and corruption takes place, this may often take place within clan and family structures, depending on the countries, of course. And of course, operators have a strong interest in double-checking their client base before they get themselves in a lot of trouble.
Okay, now let's talk about the risk-based approach that is required as a generally applicable principle in the directive. Now, what makes the risk-based approach a challenge for the industry?
Yeah, so let's contrast a dynamic risk-based approach with a more static ticking off the box approach. And of course, companies like to hear a simple, easy approach, like black and white. Okay, we do this and this, and then we are on the safe side. But I'm afraid this is no longer how it can work. So this checking off the box approach is something that we remember from the old days, but this is over. So this means a risk-based approach means to define relevant risks and then assess these risks with regard to each business relationship. And what we need is a kind of a matrix within which we have indicators to compliance staff that tell them these factors are risk factors, these factors actually can counterbalance these risk factors. So we're talking about a fairly difficult task to do actually for compliance staff.
So can you please tell us what would be, can you give examples of what would be those considered by authorities to be high-risk situations?
Mm-hmm. We have, I would say, different dimensions of risks. One dimension would relate to the product, to the services, transactions. Another one relating to customers. And maybe a third one to geographical risk. So when we take the product and the services, for instance, non-face-to-face business relationships are considered a risk factor because these risk factors may favor anonymity, may make it more difficult to check the identity, KYC. Also, payments received from unknown or unassociated third parties are considered a risk factor. Then when we talk about customer risk factors, a classic risk factor is if business is conducted in unusual circumstances. So this could be a sudden change of pattern. Let's say somebody is paying in over several months a few euros, payments of 70, 60, 50 euros, and suddenly you see payments of 7,000, 10,000, 15,000 euros. So change of pattern. Another interesting point is our company structures, arrangements that are personal asset holding vehicles. So where you see actually behind that company is one person. This is about just holding private assets. A further interesting point is ownership structure of a company that appears to be unusual or excessively complex. So, of course, a brilliant way, if I may say so, of laundering money is to have a very complex structure of your company and to have an international structure of the company, because then different prosecutors in different countries have to cooperate, and this may not always be very easy. And finally, with regard to the geographical risk factors, we think of countries that are subject to sanctions, embargoes, but also with regard to countries that have significant levels of corruption. And when we speak of high-risk countries, we shouldn't just think about, let's say, some classics as Iran, Iraq, or North Korea, but this includes actually, according to the FATF, countries such as Bosnia, Algeria, Ecuador, Panama, so countries where you might not think at once, at the first place, that this might be an issue.
Now, we spoke about the challenges so far, so let's briefly go into the opportunities from the increased AML regulatory burden. Can you tell us who stands to benefit from such burden?
Mm-hmm. So, I'm thinking here about affiliated service providers who could actually benefit from it. I did mention the risk-based approach, PEPs, customer due diligence, and that we need a kind of a matrix in which you weigh and balance risk factors. So of course this opens the door for solutions at the intersection of law, IT, risk management, and it emphasized the crucial role of IT solutions. But again, everybody trying to provide such solutions should keep in mind that these tools must be flexible enough to incorporate future changes of regulation.
Okay, now briefly, can you tell us, because I see we're short on time here, in your view, how would this affect the growth process of the gaming industry?
Yeah, of course it's hard to predict, but what we definitely see is a yet increased need for specialized compliance staff and an ongoing training of that staff as well. So this risk-based approach requires actually quite a dynamic case-by-case assessment, and your staff will only be able to do that if they are very well trained. Now, I see actually two roads. One is the road of mergers that we already see, that companies continue to merge because compliance costs simply increase. Another way that we may see is that companies decide to, instead of recruiting an army of compliance officers, to buy in more of those external expertise through training, through kind of hotlines that they make contact. And these services obviously can be provided by, for instance, qualified gaming lawyers.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Planzer, and thank you all.
Thank you.